Hi, we complete chapter 20 in Genesis with the surprising conclusion where Abimelech, having charged Abraham passionately with several accusations, now rewards him extravagantly. So, what is going on here that after their very confusing exchange we looked at in the last video, suddenly Abimelech is pouring wealth all over Abraham and Sarah and doing it with an explanation that is incredibly misleading, that we know is misleading, but perhaps Abraham does not, although Sarah certainly does. So in the story that has so much to do with who knows what, we as readers have a privileged position to be able to evaluate this in a way that Abraham does not. So returning to the right side of our screen where we see the three wife-sister stories in comparison, I actually updated this from what I had last time because I didn't have down here in the middle one, the one we're on now, this parallel to what we had in the one in Egypt back in chapter 12, and they certainly are parallel, so I'd missed that one. So we have that here, and yet what it highlights is the dramatic contrast between both the ending in terms of what happens and also justification in Abimelech's mind or in Pharaoh's mind. Because when this one ended, after Yahweh afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues, Pharaoh goes to Abraham and says, "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me? Now take her and go." Um, and whereas here, we'll see Abimelech offers him land and tells him to settle, and everything looks so happy, even though the circumstances that led to the conclusion are virtually identical. So we'll have to see what's going on there and the difference between Abimelech and Pharaoh in that. And then we'll note that when we get to chapter 26, there's nothing like that here. There's nothing when the same or a different Abimelech sends Isaac and Rebekah away. There's no kind of reward or anything there at all. So I won't go back over what I've been doing the last couple of videos showing the scenes and the chiasms. You can go back to the last video. And again, if you haven't looked at the introduction of these three chapters, I really encourage you to go back to the introduction of Genesis 20 to 22 to get some context, both in terms of the narrative context and the social world of the likely audience. So going back to our story, so Abraham had finished his explanation for whatever it's worth. This is the hesed that you must do me. He was speaking of Sarah. At every place to which we come, say of me is my brother. And after that, Abimelech doesn't say that makes sense, or wait a minute, that doesn't make sense, or thank you for sharing, or anything at all. He simply acts. And after all the words here, now there's action. Although Abimelech will speak both to Abraham and to Sarah, but neither of them will speak in response. And Sarah is not speaking throughout this whole thing, so we have no idea what she's thinking or feeling, and whether she watched the previous exchange between her husband, brother, and Abimelech or not. Suddenly she's here, but we hadn't heard that she was there until this moment. So let's go back to verse 14 and see what we've got. So Abimelech took sheep and oxen, male and female slaves, matching so far exactly what we heard Pharaoh did in Egypt. So whether that's meant to say that all kings offer the same results, or readers remember the other story, that certainly seems more likely. And in the Exodus, or in the story in chapter 12, it added female donkeys and camels. That's not added here, but more is added, as we'll see. So he gave them to Abraham. Notice not to Sarah, and as some have suggested, that's perhaps because of the patriarchal situation of the time. Maybe could have given to both of them. We don't hear that. And restored or returned his wife Sarah to him. This is the one thing that God had told him to do. Let's go back and look briefly at that so we can remember two aspects of that scene. So in verse 7, Yahweh's response is, "Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her," same word here, "know that you shall surely die, you and all that is yours." So when we see in our scene, he's doing exactly what God told him to do, restoring his wife Sarah, which is to highlight this is the accusation in God's mind. Since God protected both Sarah and Abimelech from Abimelech having sex with her, the only charge that is subject to the death penalty is having taken Abraham's woman slash sister, and he returns that. So he could have just stopped right there and all would be well between Abimelech and God, and presumably between Abimelech and Abraham. But he goes on with an amazing offer. Abimelech said, "My land is before you. Settle where it pleases you," or literally, settle where it looks good in your eyes. A important phrase that echoes Lot back in chapter 13. Let's go back and look at that briefly. Lot looked about him and saw the plain of the Jordan was well watered. And so to say this is what looked, literally, the phrase looked here, lifted up his eyes and saw. So it's same kind of phrase here. He's deciding in his own eyes what looks good. At least that's what Abimelech tells Abraham to do. But if we go back to the beginning of the chapter, we can see where Abraham was in the beginning of this chapter. We were told he had journeyed toward the region of the Negeb, the south, and settled between Kadesh and Shur, and while residing in Gerar as an alien. So if we look at the map again, we can remember Gerar is here, and Shur is here, and Kadesh is here. And so these other places that are named are in this area. And yet it said he's, as a resident alien, a Gur in Gerar. We know the wordplay there. So he's already spending time there. Scholars have interpreted the relationship between the residing in Gerar as an alien and settling here as he's taking little trips into Gerar as an alien while he's settling somewhere else. But when we get to our immediate scene down here, we hear him offering, settle where it pleases you. But he's already in the land somewhere. Notice first it's a contrast with Pharaoh, who says, get out of here. Why is Abimelech welcoming Abraham into this land with the woman that he has not had sex with, but Abraham doesn't know that? We just have to hold on to that to see if we can understand Abimelech's motives once we see the whole thing here. We also will not hear that Abraham accepts the offer. He doesn't respond to it one way or another here. But the next thing we're going to hear in 21:14 is where Hagar goes after she is expelled by Sarah with Abraham's cooperation. And then we'll see Isaac and Sarah and Abraham all in separate places. So he will not settle in this place, although we're told he was already settled in a region just outside of that. And then he turns to Sarah and says, look, Hina here, and Hina is in the verse twice, although it's not translated either place, the behold word in Hebrew. I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. And notice, your brother, not your husband. Westermann notes that by the rules governing such a society, the wife cannot acquire it. It depends on what we mean by such a society. In a patriarchal society, certainly the man would control the wealth, but I don't see why in the world of the audience, in exile and post-exile, they couldn't understand this was given them together. But that's not what happens. He says, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It's such a huge amount that it's unimaginable, and we'll see in chapter 23, when Abraham negotiates with the Hittites for a place to bury the dead Sarah, he can just pour out a couple of hundred pieces of silver like it's nothing. And we know, and maybe the Hittites know why, if the Hittites know what's happening in this scene through the rumor mill, but we don't know that. But it's a huge amount of money. And then it's described in a fascinating way, and the English does not render the Hebrew well here. It is your exoneration. Here's the second hint. The word for exoneration here literally means to be a covering of eyes before all of yours. And so that's meant to be to say we won't look at this in detail. And Hepher notes the connection between the Tamar story that we looked at briefly last time as a link here. This is Tamar fooling her uncle, Judah. She put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down in the entrance to Enim. So she's covering herself so that he doesn't recognize her, and that's similar to what's being implied here, that she's being covered so people won't claim her to be someone who had sex with the king. In other words, he's not denying that he had sex with her, even though we know he didn't. He's attempting to have a payoff so that that would suggest that he's bought back her honor. Whether you can buy back somebody's honor you had sex with is another story. That brings up the situation in chapter 34 when Dinah, the one daughter of Jacob, is raped by the prince of the city, Shechem, and the sons end up killing all, Jacob's sons end up killing all of the Shechemites, with leading the question, should our sister be treated as a whore? So he might ask the same question here. Does this mean that Abraham's sister or wife, Sarah, is being treated as a whore for whom this king has spent $1,000 or 1,000 pieces of silver? It does not look good. The phrase "you were completely vindicated" is a difficult one to translate, as West calls it completely unintelligible. But the root word, which cannot be pronounced without verbs here, as the medieval Jewish commentator Rashi suggests, can mean to prove. And so now you'll have the opportunity to be proven justified. Raskow, a modern scholar, argues that it can also mean rebuke. So in vindicating Sarah, the king is also rebuking her. But what would he be rebuking Sarah for? She hasn't done anything throughout this whole story. So Abimelech is going out of his way to indicate publicly, but presumably before all his servants who we saw were around, and certainly before Abraham and Sarah, that he's making up for having had sex with somebody else's wife, which we know he didn't do. So we'll come back to that again in verse 18. So now we note the reverse order here in verse 17 and 18, which creates a wonderful piece of suspense. So then Abraham prayed to God, just as God told Abimelech he would do. Whether Abraham knew that God told him that, we don't know. We don't have any reason to think that Abraham knew that God appeared to Abimelech in the dream. Abimelech didn't tell him that. How else would he know? Does Abraham know that God sees him as a prophet, or this is his role? And not only that, why does he have to pray to a God that Abimelech plainly has a direct relationship to? God's the one who said, Abraham will pray for you. But since all God asked Abimelech to do is return Sarah to her rightful husband, so to speak, as a piece of property in a patriarchal context, and he's done that, what further need for prayer or intercession is there? And that's literally what the word here, the pilel, in the hitpatel stem means in Hebrew, is to intercede or mediate. So it doesn't have to mean pray. It could be, in what we think of as a secular sense, to intercede before a king or somebody like that. But here, why we don't know why Abraham needs to intercede for somebody who has a direct relationship to God. But there it is. And then we find the twist. And God healed Abimelech. And the root word for healing is only one other time in Genesis. There's really surprisingly very little about illness or healing, a need for healing in all of Genesis. But what could he have healed Abimelech of? Well, we finish the sentence and we find out. Using the same word, also healed his wife and female slaves, so they bore children. So plainly, what Abimelech needs to be healed of is the inability to provide the male part of having children. In other words, he's impotent. Whether lifelong or not, because we only hear in verse 18, Yahweh had closed fast all the wombs of the house of Abimelech, but we don't hear that Yahweh closed up the urethra of Abimelech, so to speak, or prevented sperm from being made in his body or anything else like that. So we have no reason to think it was ever anything other for Abimelech, although it's described as he has a woman, but that wouldn't necessarily mean anything. We know that Potiphar has a wife that he can't have sex with because he's a eunuch down in chapter 37 and following. So there could be all kinds of reasons why a king has a wife without the ability to have sex with her that would be fruitful of children. And he may well have these other female slaves who can bear children, just as Jacob and Rachel and Leah will in the next cycle. Now we realize that Abimelech has been hiding his impotence all along. Whether that's just simply out of shame and embarrassment that he's a king and can't have a child, but perhaps what we can imagine is he did try to have sex with Sarah, but then realized he couldn't, or she was available to him, but he knew that he couldn't, so he didn't. And yet perhaps his honor was on the line, so he does this publicly to act like someone who can do that. And it leaves Abraham with the unfortunate and uncomfortable situation of not being sure whether Abimelech had sex with his wife or not, and whether when she becomes pregnant, in the very next scene, Abimelech is the source of her pregnancy. And when we get to chapter 21 in the next scene, we'll see the narrators and the midrash that comment on it make it even more complex than that in a surprising sort of way. So Abimelech is healed, and his woman and the female slaves are all bearing children all at once, or is this supposed to be over the time that comes? We don't know. But then something really strange happens, because we're told in reverse chronological order that before that, the cause that needed healing was Yahweh had closed fast all the wombs. So are we supposed to hear that Elohim is changing something that Yahweh had done? Because plainly in two different verses here to have these, if we're not going to follow the source sense that these are from different sources from different time periods, but without verse 18, verse 17 wouldn't make sense, and without verse 17, leaving it in verse 18 wouldn't make sense. So the story only makes sense with both the pieces here, and regardless of who wrote them originally or how far apart in time they might have been, the story only fits with it having it the way it is here. And so the way it is here, it's suggesting that Elohim is overriding Yahweh, who had closed fast all the wombs here. And I noticed that the word for closing fast, atzar, here is used, both for in 16:2 for Hagar there. But let's look at this brief scene in Isaiah 66, the very end of the long book of Isaiah, where Yahweh is speaking about Jerusalem after exile. Shall I open the womb and not deliver, says Yahweh? Shall I, the one who delivers, shut the womb, says your God? And rejoice with Jerusalem, etc. And so Jerusalem is the one who's going to have children, and it's expressing the joy of the post-exilic rebuilding of the temple and the welcoming of people. But it's highlighting that Yahweh is the one who has power over wombs, whether those are literal wombs or metaphorical wombs, over the power to give life from a city or from individuals. Is that something different than Elohim? We don't know, but we're told it's because of Sarah, Abraham's woman, even though just a couple of verses earlier he referred to her as her brother, given your brother, but now the narrator concludes it by saying Abraham's woman. But why because of Sarah? Why did the wombs of all the other women in Abimelech's house have to be closed? Sarah wasn't going to have sex with them. There's no way that they were at risk, and Abraham certainly wasn't going to. So we don't know any reason why, within the logic of a story that's not very logical, of why Yahweh would close all the wombs of all those women, unless it's simply to be parallel to the story in Egypt, where we were told that that God had closed the wombs of all the Egyptian women too. So we'll enter into chapter 21, and as we move through these scenes, again, I want to highlight that this is part of this larger chiasm that fills all chapter 20 and 21, and the birth of Isaac, the beautiful scene that it is going to carry the resonances of all the deception and all the tumult in the household that we knew was before this, which will find itself manifest in the scene that follows. See you then for that. Bye-bye.